Welcome to all students in design of transmission system. There is a unit like sliding and rolling contact bearing. In today we discuss in bearing the classification. Bearing is a mechanical element which supports two machine parts and permits relative motion between them with minimum friction. It has two or more contacting surfaces and load carrying components. The functions of bearing is ensures relative motion between two machine parts with minimum friction. The bearing supports and locates the shaft in its correct position. The bearing takes the load and force acting on the shaft and transfer it to the stationary frame or general. The classification bearing depending upon the direction of the load to be supported, that is radial bearings and thrust bearing. Also depending upon the nature of contact depending upon nature there is sliding contact bearings and loading contact bearing. In figure these diagram are showing the radial bearing and thrust bearing. This is sliding contact bearing and rolling contact bearing. Now we discuss about radial bearing. The radial bearing, the load acts perpendicular to the axis of the shaft. The radial force Ft acts in the radial direction over the circumference of the bearing element. In thrust bearing, okay, this is the thrust bearing. In thrust bearing, the load acts along the axis of the shaft. Okay. After this classification of bearing based on nature of frictional contact, this is the depend upon sliding contact bearings and rolling contact bearing. The sliding contact bearings, the shaft is separated from the frame or bush by a film of lubricating oil. The film of lubricating oil ensures the shaft is floating inside the bush during operation and thus reduces the frictional power loss. Sliding contact bearings are also referred as plain bearings, journal bearings or sleeve bearings. So, in rolling contact bearing, the shaft is separated from the frame or bush by rolling elements such as balls or rollers. The rolling elements such as balls or rollers ensure point or line contact, thus transferring maximum load with lower frictional power loss. Rolling contact bearings are also referred as anti-friction bearing. So, now we discuss rolling contact bearing. After this rolling contact, we discuss about sliding contact bearings. First we discuss about rolling contact bearing. In rolling contact bearing, there are two types like ball bearing and roller bearings. In rolling contact bearing, the ball bearing having 6 types: single row deep groove ball bearing, single row deep groove ball bearing with notch, self-aligning bearing, double row deep groove ball bearing, thrust ball bearing, angular contact bearing. In roller bearing, there is cylindrical roller bearing, spherical roller bearing, taper roller bearing, needle roller bearing. After this, we discuss about types of sliding contact bearings. It is very important topic like types of sliding contact bearings. In these types of sliding contact bearing, there are two main types like based on mode of lubrication and second is based on relative motion between contacting surface. In based on mode of lubrication there are two types: hydrodynamic bearing or hydrostatic bearing, and based on relative motion guide bearing, journal bearing, thrust bearing. Journal bearing having two types: full journal bearing, partial journal bearing, and thrust bearings having pivot bearing and collar bearing. So these are the types of sliding contact bearing. According to this, there is hydrodynamic bearing. In hydrodynamic bearing, the load supporting fluid film is created by the shape and relative motion between the sliding surfaces. The principle of hydrodynamic operation is initially the shaft is at rest and it settles at the bottom under the action of load B. Hydrostatic bearing, the load supporting fluid film is created by an external source such as pump. In guide bearing, the relative motion between the two contacting surfaces is pure linear. In journal bearing, the relative motion between the two contacting surfaces is pure rotary and the load on the bearing is perpendicular to the shaft. Journal bearing is also referred as sleeve bearing. In journal bearing may be full journal bearing or partial journal bearing. The construction of journal bearing is illustrated. In thrust bearing, the relative motion between the two contacting surfaces is pure rotary and the load on the bearing is parallel to the axis of the shaft. So, this is very important part of thrust bearing. After this, now we discuss about the sliding contact bearings according to the thickness of layer of the lubricant. Thick film bearing. The thick film bearings are those in which the working surfaces are completely separated from each other by the lubricant. Such type of bearings are also called as hydrodynamic lubricated bearings. Second is thin film bearings. The thin film bearings are those in which although lubricant is present, the working surfaces partially contact each other at least part of the time. Such type of bearings are also called boundary lubricated bearings. And next, zero film bearings. The zero film bearings are those which operate without any lubricant present. And next, hydrostatic or externally pressurized lubricated bearing. The hydrostatic bearings are those which can support steady loads without any relative motion between the journal and the bearing. This is achieved by forcing externally pressurized lubricant between the members. So, thank you all of you.